Today we're talking game design. Do you create an open sandbox that the players can explore in any direction, or do you create ponds and streams for your players to shift between and explore the world at their own pace? All that and more coming up right now. Hello everybody and welcome to the Eldritch Lorecast. My name is Ben Byrne and we are here with James Hake, Dale Kingsmill, Sean Merwin, and this is your new favourite D&D podcast. Fresh, new, out of the wrapper, shiny, still got that new podcast smell to it. And I'm here with my very esteemed guests. James Hake, do you consider yourself more of a wizard, a rogue, or a fighter?
Hello, can I say paladin?
Yeah, okay, sure, yeah.
If you're asking me for classic RPG roles, though, I'm absolutely the tank. That's what I aim to be. I strive to be the guy who can take it for everyone else. Team player me.
Okay, so it's more about protecting others than it is about like just feeling indestructible yourself.
Yeah. Oh no, I'm not here to be a big colossus. It's to make sure that we all get through it together.
Okay, cool. Fair enough. Dale Kingsmill, what about you? Which role do you like to fill?
If there could be an opposite to that answer, it would be mine. I am living the rogue cliche. I want to be a half-elf thief slinking through the night anytime.
Fair enough. Sean Merwin, are you going to fill that third role for us, or do you fall in line somewhere there?
Well, here's what I do. I say I'm the wizard, but I am definitely not smart enough to be the wizard. So I am a rogue as well, but I'm just pretending to be the wizard because then people will leave me alone.
Right, you're like a rogue pretending to play somebody else. Isn't that like I've had that a couple times where people are like, I'm a cleric, but I play a rogue, or I'm a rogue, but I'm playing a cleric, or something else to try to throw people off the scent of what their character actually is. If this is your first time joining us, and it would be because this is the first episode, this is a brand new tabletop role-playing podcast brought to you by Ghostfire Gaming. And we are going to jump straight into the news, which we want to try bring you guys every single week. So starting off with the Ghostfire Gaming news specifically, the Grim Hollow Player's Guide, which has been a project that's been in the works for at least a couple of months now, is finally starting to reach the backers who backed the Kickstarter. I think Australian backers are getting theirs now, and US shouldn't be too far away, and then it'll be available on the store. Sean, you came in at the very end of this project and worked on it, didn't you?
I did. I was coming in when the writing was mostly finished, so it was just some editing and the layout and a few little dribs and drabs of rules needed to be done. But I was very excited when I heard that it was a Kickstarter before I even dreamed of being part of Ghostfire Gaming. So it was quite a treat to come in at the end and help finish it off.
What was it that attracted you to the project?
Ghostfire was not afraid to really put some crunch into things that other people would just sort of play around with role-playing wise. Things like lycanthropy and vampirism and things that players sometimes really want to get into, but it's hard to handle with the rules. And I think Ghostfire Gaming did a great job with their transformations of letting that happen.
Yeah, I'm definitely, what I love about it is the fact that it's a dark fantasy supplement that is, not afraid, like you said, to give rules to certain things. I know in the campaign guide, which was the book that they did earlier, had grievous wounds, like permanent injury mechanics, which are really good. So for people who, like myself, enjoy running those dark fantasy elements, there's a lot there in terms of specific rules that help kind of ground 5th edition, which 5th edition can feel very floaty with how naturally high magic it can sort of be. Dale, were you a fan of dark fantasy? Are you a fan of dark fantasy?
I am a fan of dark fantasy, but I like my dark fantasy to not get too grim and gritty, if that makes sense. Which actually, this is I got a chance to look through the player's guide just the other day, and I was so stoked because you've got this, like, of course there's a dedication to the dark fantasy genre, but a recognition that that little glimmers of brightness and hope are actually things that elevate the darkness. I think that's important to me. It's like that bit in in Lord of the Rings when they're heading towards Mordor and everything's really getting dark and terrible and all these things. And they see that statue of the king with his head removed and it's, he's been vandalized. But then the light comes from the sunset and lights up the king's head and the flowers are growing around his head. And Frodo says, oh, the king has a crown again. It's those moments to me that really like bring it up. And it feels to me like Grim Hollow does that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, Sean, you just touched on the lycanthropy and the vampiric transformations, but the player's guide introduces a couple of new ones, like if you want to turn into a fey creature or if you want to turn into a primordial, So there's non-horror transformations that you can make as horrific or as non-horrific as you want. James, you joined Ghostfire a little bit after the player's guide, but have you had a chance to flick through it?
Yes. So player content is not usually my thing. I'm the forever DM of my group. I'm always thinking about how can we do stories on a larger scale, and I trust my players to handle the nitty-gritty of their characters, especially from a mechanical point of view. I love to get involved with players from a let's say from a backstory and forward story point of view, and anything that comes in game. If they're a cleric and they've got their spells, or they're an artificer and they've got their spells, or this and that, the other thing, I trust them to know what their character can do. And I like it when they surprise me. This is something that I don't think a lot of DMs enjoy, actually, but I encourage them to try it. Be surprised as a DM. You're playing this game, right? You're a player of the game too. You're not just the arbiter of the rules. You are here to have those same sort of shocks and twists and turns that everyone else has. You're just also playing the monsters.
Yeah, I agree. I have to admit, I kind of sit where I like to know the players' plans, and I do like to know their abilities. But what's a great surprise, James, that you've had from your players that kind of encapsulates that for you? Not to put you on the spot.
I love it when players use weird combinations of their abilities to do things I never possibly could have imagined. I think of one combat encounter that happened back in 3rd edition. This is a thing I always come back to, and I had a Hydra that was in a tight cave corridor, and this Hydra had this plan. It was lurking at the top of a sheer 30-foot cliff, and the players were on the bottom, and he was hiding, ready to ambush the first guy that came up the cliff. And 3 things happened. 1, the wizard used familiar to see what was at the top of the cliff and saw the Hydra. 2, the sorcerer cast grease on the top of the cliff. And 3, the rogue was able to be cast invisibility upon, snuck up the top of the cliff, and this was a rogue that invested a little bit into strength too. Got up behind the Hydra, pushed it, and let it tumble down the cliff, taking a bunch of falling damage and falling prone, and the rest of the party just leapt upon it. And so, this very cool, nasty trap that I'd sprung for my players had been totally dismantled because they decided to get a little bit funky with it. And I loved it. It was awesome. I wasn't mad at all. I was like, I didn't get to do my cool thing, but they did a cooler thing because they didn't have the full information. The thing they did was cool because they were a bunch of people who all worked together to do something neat, rather than me kind of coming up with a little clockwork problem.
Yeah, See, I like to know those plans in advance because I'm the sort of DM that there's been a couple times where parties have tried something, maybe not quite like that, but let's say for argument's sake, similar. But because I don't know what they're trying to do, I'm sort of like, it doesn't work out the way they want it to. And there's a bit of a deflation in the room. And I'm like, I'm not sure, because everybody has their own, I suppose, maybe it sounds silly to say everybody has their own understanding of physics, because physics are physics, right? But when you're all imagining something with hydras and grease and invisibility, your imagining of what the result of something would be might be different. So I like to know those plans ahead of time so that I can figure out what they're trying to do and try to help them achieve that.
Yeah, I suppose that's what like Matt Colville talks about, right? Where he says, tell me what you're trying to achieve, so that we can both be on the same page about how you're going to achieve it, so I can help you to achieve it. Because, sometimes just the image you're describing is not the same as the one being described, if that makes sense.
And part of it comes back to the tips for DMs. Maybe 5 or 6 on the list is be a fan of the players. And that sort of plays into it a bit. Don't try to stop them from doing what they're doing. Just get an idea for what they're doing and help them tell this cool story that they're trying to tell.
I have this terrible part of myself, though, that's too competitive. I try not to be. Like, my philosophy as a dungeon master, when I think about it, is don't be competitive, be a fan of the players. You're not playing against them, you're playing with them. But I have this, like, it's that DM thing of, like, sinking feeling if the encounter that you poured your heart into is getting solved too quickly. You're like, oh, man, I thought this was going to be... they're cleverer than me, I suppose.
And now we know why you're such a fan of dark fantasy. Now we know why you're such a fan of dark fantasy. It's because you need to punish the player. No, that's not true. That's not true. No, I was just going to say, when I opened the Grim Hollow Player's Guide, these are my notes directly regarding, I looked at the contents page, and the first few things are like, the world is lost, the gods are dead, humanity is cruel.
Yeah. How does that not sound like the perfect weekend? I cracked open the Player's Handbook. I was fortunate enough to sneak one, which you might be able to see just there on my bookshelf, out of the Ghostfire Gaming offices when I was there. And wanted to run a Grim Hollow campaign, took the book to my players, of which there are 2 because we're in lockdown at the moment. So I'm just playing with my housemate and partner. And I gave them the Grim Hollow Player's Guide, and I said, look, here's this. You can pick some subclasses out of there if you want to, but I'm not making it like a mandate that you have to pick it from there. We can use any supplement you want to because this is a game we're all playing together. And the both of them flicked through it, and immediately one of them was like, I want to play a Plague Paladin. And the other one was like, I want a ghost that haunts me, and I'm going to, get my magic from that. It's my dead husband who I murdered for mistreatment. I was like, okay, intense, but it's dark fantasy. Cool. Sean, did you have a favorite subclass, or did you get to touch any of those subclasses before the book was released?
I did. I did some editing, did a little development on them. There are so many good ones. The Outlaw is one of my favorite. The
yes.
Rogue subclass with sort of the highwayman sort of feel to it that uses firearms and is proficient with riding a horse because you have to ride in. You can't just stand in the road. There's too much danger out in the road even for the rogues to be out there for too long. So you have to keep moving. I love the feel of that.
Yeah, that caught my eye immediately as well. It's definitely a really unique feeling subclass as well. What about you, Dale?
I 1,000,000% want to play that. That's the first one that I was like, that's what I want to play, is this Highway Rider. But I did also immediately the Monk Way of Pride. I have a player in one of my games who's only just kind of picked their subclass, and they weren't in love with any of the options. And then I read the Way of Pride, and I was like, this is their character. This is them. And so I just immediately took it to them and I said, what do you think? And now it's in my game.
Right. Perfect. There you go. There's something super evocative about them. Is there any other parts of the book that we really loved flicking through it? I'm trying to remember because I got them both at the same time with the campaign guide. Some parts of it kind of glom together in my head, and I can't remember what's from which book. But are there any parts that we want to pick out and really go over?
The Sangromancy for me is something that was really cool because it lets you use your hit dice to power spells a little bit more, unless you take the Sangromancer subclass, in which one of the benefits of taking the subclass is you get these dice that you can use instead of using your hit dice to power it. So it's not something that just this one subclass can use. Any wizard can use it, but it does add a bit of risk versus reward if you use those spells, which I'm a big fan of.
Sean, I think it's really funny that you mentioned Sangromancy because that's almost exactly what I was going to talk about. I was going to talk about transformations, which are something that is just like innately Grim Hollow to me. It's something that's such a core pillar of the setting because your player characters aren't these invincible, unchangeable, only growing in power sort of heroes. I mean, the thing about dark fantasy is that people face setbacks and things get worse for them. And even in D&D, where, you know, it's kind of a power fantasy sort of game, your power is always increasing. You can dark fantasyify it by making this power something that comes at a grim cost. And so I was just thinking about, there's a ton of them, but the vampire transformation is someone who eventually gets this sort of innate sangromancy power. And I was just overwhelmed by how many transformations there are in here, and how interesting they all are, and how you can really kind of pick and choose the ways that your boons and your flaws interact, and really create a customized character on a whole new axis unique to the 5th edition rule set.
Yeah, and because those transformation abilities also can stack with your racial and class abilities, there's potential for some really cool combinations there. Just discussing it in the office, I talked about doing a vampire barbarian transformation, which a couple people were like, oh, I didn't think of that. But I just love the idea of your vampire abilities are all usable while you rage, or at least most of them are off the top of my head. And so that means that when you rage, it's that moment at the end of Van Helsing where, you know, Dracula's all sort of, you know, dapper and I am Dracula, whatever, and then just like goes ballistic and turns into this giant bat monster, and suddenly he's in the depths of a bloodlust. So yeah, super evocative rules in there.
Sorry, I'm wearing a shirt that says equal rights for werewolves, because that's what I one day hope to be, is a highway rider werewolf.
You should do the whole Little Red Riding Hood trope. You're sort of, you know, Little Red Riding Hood out on the road, but you're the werewolf. Jumping along, also in Ghostfire Gaming news, the Quest-o-Nomicon is a Kickstarter that's currently still going. There's about 4 days left in it at time of recording. If you've jumped on this podcast as soon as it's hit, you might still have a day or two to go grab the Quest-o-Nomicon through Kickstarter. It is forged by Ghostfire, which means that the company is basically providing or facilitating the production and publication of the book, but it is entirely written by Jake and Buds and the XP to Level 3 crew, if you're a fan of their YouTube channel. They've developed this really cool supplement, which is designed, I don't know whether this was deliberate or not on their part, but it's designed for low-level play, basically giving you enough XP to get from Level 1 to Level 3. And there's 5 different adventures which have different themes to them. And there's also 2 different kind of ways of playing each of the 5 adventures, depending on which villain you want to put into it. Dale, you were following this Kickstarter earlier on, weren't you? Before we even started, before this podcast was a glimmer in our eyes.
I was, and I was excited the other day on the XP to Level 3 channel. They did a sort of live stream let's play of one of the adventures from the game. It was the heist with the devil villain. I was very excited to get to watch that. No, it seems like so much fun. It's the kind of thing that I really like, where it gives the DM opportunities to you put choices in front of your players, but still preparing the DM for those choices. You know, you've got these adventures, but it's like, which villain do you want to use? Which one sounds cooler to your players? Okay, you're doing the heist. All right, well, here are some heist tropes. Any one of these would work, but which one do you want to use? Which one sounds the most fun to you? And it sort of gives you the tools to do all of those.
Is that what, like, from the 5 flavors of fantasy that you've seen, do you think is it the Western is the heist? Is it the train heist?
Yeah, it is. It's so the flavor. It's beautiful, delicious. I just the other day with one of my D&D groups, we were talking about how much we want to do a train heist, and there it is, just put right in front of us.
You've sparked a question in my mind that I'm curious about, just as a adventure designer, talking about the sort of intentionally modular nature of these adventures. And I'm curious to pull from you 3, and actually anyone listening right now, I'd love to hear your opinion too. When you get a D&D adventure or an RPG adventure, do you prefer for the adventure to show one way through, sort of this is the ideal path through this adventure, and just kind of trust you as the DM to know your players and trust that you can improvise things yourself, make up new stuff on your own? Or do you like it when adventures are very sort of loosey-goosey and say, here's a scenario, and here are a variety of different ways that it could be played through. Now, pick and choose from this variety. I have my thoughts on this, and maybe I'll share them after I've asked you guys, but I really want to know what you think on this.
Maybe you'll share them, or maybe you'll leave forever because you're so offended by what we say. I like things to be modular to a degree. I'm a big fan of that Dragon Heisty, and these bits can go together in different orders. I don't know. Yesterday I was reading through some old blog entries on the Alexandrian where he Justin Alexander. I believe it's Justin Alexander is his name. Could be wrong. But it's a great blog full of lots of resources. He has an entry where he talks about the difference between setting up plots and setting up sort of situations. And the situations are things that, it has these key elements that will always be true, but the players can choose how they deal with that in any way, in any order. And I think that's kind of how I like my adventures to be written, where it's like, these are key locations, key events that will happen. And now it's up to the players what they do with that.
I personally think that there is no wrong way to write an adventure, depending on the content that you're trying to cover. So if you're trying to write something like a heist, if you try to make a heist too linear, you're not doing the DM any favors when they try to run it, because anything can happen in a heist. And things should go wrong in a heist. Every good heist film, book, movie, things go wrong. However, if you're trying to write, say, a 2-hour convention adventure that has to, fit into a certain amount of time, you want the adventure to be more enclosed, and you're doing the DM a service by making it more linear and helping them through. So I don't think there is a right or a wrong way. I think there are right and wrong instances to use certain types of adventures with.
Yeah, I would agree with basically both of those. I think that if you're writing like a long form adventure that's meant to be a couple of hours long, you can kind of, maybe you create more narrow sections that then open up into larger sections. So it might be a small dungeon that's got a couple of different pathways, but ultimately what's in each room is what's in each room, and the players conquer it and come back out. But when they get back to the village, it's more of an open, dare I use the term, sandbox sort of area where there's lots of things for the players to go and, press the button on and interact with. They can do that in any order that they want. But I guess the philosophy, I haven't done adventure writing to the scale of you, James, or Sean, so don't let me lecture you to how it's done. But my philosophy generally in terms of how I've approached it and thought about that question, James, is to think of it almost like a script writer and a director. The script writer writes kind of ideally what's in their mind, but they trust the director to take that script and elevate it and change it if it needs to be changed. And so, pardon me, I try not to direct the adventure in the writing of it, if that makes sense. Like, I try not to, describe a room, but don't describe the order in which things will be found necessarily. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. One, don't sell yourself short. All game masters are adventure designers in their way, and in fact, your perspective as someone who does not write D&D adventures for a living is much more valuable than the sort of D&D writer perspective that I live in my head all the time. I know what those weirdos think like. Sean, you understand me.
I understand you completely. Weirdos unite.
I have, over the course of the last couple of years, come to a style that suits me well for writing big adventures. This is the sort of thing that you will see enacted in fables quite a lot, I think, when the mysterious Fables project eventually reveals itself to the world. But it is I'll call it a pool and stream system where there are major parts of the adventure that are like pools. They have enclosed boundaries, wide open interiors, and a lot of stuff floating around in them the characters can interact with however they like. And then connecting one pool to another is a very narrow little stream that keeps the overall plot of the adventure on track. I think of the game The Witcher, the first game in CD Projekt Red's The Witcher series, that follows this sort of mini sandbox style very well, because every chapter of that game is a sort of expansive little zone you can explore, and there's a self-contained story, and it's got this sort of episodic feel to it. And then you do all the quests and eventually you progress the story. And the story knows exactly where it's headed in that game. It may provide some reactions to your choices and some alternate pathways. But we adventure designers are not gods. We know that very well. We cannot predict every potential possibility for the story. We have to stick to an idea and kind of full steam ahead with it, while also giving players the agency that they want to really feel like the main characters of the story, which they are. And I just have to trust that by providing a relatively linear story with a lot of opportunities for player expression, that if there are major divergences from the riverway that I have set out for them, the dungeon master will have it in their head that I can make that up. I can find a way to sort of reroute a new river to get back into the next pool, or I can make a new pool of my own and kind of steal the water cup by cup out of another pool, and no one will ever know the difference, because that's what feels most natural for the story.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I did an interview with Jesse Skye at some point, who worked on Odyssey of the Dragon Lords, and he worked on Dragon Age, the video games.
Cool.
And I asked him, there's so many things from tabletop RPGs that have been sort of nicked and used by video games over time, and I asked whether there was anything that he took from his experience working on video games and applied to his work in tabletop RPG design, and he said that. He said lakes and rivers was the big thing that he took from working.
Is that actually what he said? That's incredible.
Literally what he said. Yep. Exactly that.
It's the weirdo brain, Dale. It's the weirdo brain.
It's the weirdo brain. I have to develop one for myself.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think there's a lot in sort of game design and philosophy that you can learn from playing video games and sort of analyzing their structure. Because it's interesting that you bring up The Witcher, James, which is one of my favorite series. And for anybody who's listened to me on a podcast before, I didn't bring up The Witcher first. It was James this time. But yeah, I haven't played the first one, but the second one had that kind of structure that you're talking about, where, you know, you're in Flotsam, I think it's called, is the initial place, and then that rivers you through. But the interesting thing about that game from an RPG design perspective is the fact that it's so divergent in the middle. You basically play a completely different game depending on one sort of hinge choice that you make early on. And then the game's completely different until the third chapter, where you're kind of, you know, a couple of those choices start to converge and you're back in a predetermined space, versus the design philosophy of The Witcher 3, where they tried to go full Skyrim open world and were just like, go in any direction, anything's possible, it's all there for the taking, which I think is a great design philosophy, but very challenging for role-playing games, because there's so much groundwork that goes into creating an experience that's authentically like that.
If I can get on my soapbox for a second, I just think that open world is a trap. Like, this is just my opinion. You may have had different experiences than me. But if you try and make your RPG campaign total sandbox, total open world, Skyrim style, go in every direction, you are setting yourself up to fail. Because you need to do the amount of like immediate development work of a video game design team of hundreds. And also walking around Skyrim, because it's a graphical game, is a very fun and beautiful experience. Wandering in any direction in your RPG game doesn't have quite the same charm to it because you can't really get lost in the intricacies and environment of that world quite as well.
And even if you are brilliant, even if you are a brilliant DM and you can just make things up on the fly and do all of that thing, you also need the right kind of player to play in an open sandbox world. Because a lot of times if you try to run something like that, my experience is you say, hey, here's the whole world, and the players just sit there going, oh dear, what do we do now? Because they expect you to deliver a little bit of the story to get things started. So, having that thread that you can follow, having the stream to get people to the pool, having the river to get people to the lake is very valuable as an adventure writer, as a DM, and as a player.
It relieves me to hear you both say that, to be honest, because I feel like early advice for starting Dungeon Masters, almost like a cudgel, is like, fear the railroad, fear the concept that your characters have to go down a certain path. And if you're not doing a sandbox, a true sandbox, then you're not doing it right. Maybe that's something that I've, I can't point to a source and said, this person told me this, but maybe that's something that I've internalized from various sources. But it's a relief to know that you don't have to invent the whole world and everything in it before you can start playing. Which, starting playing, just quickly jumping back to the Quest-o-Nomicon, I think that the customizability of these adventures, the fact that there is multiple potential in them, depending on what villain you want to play within the adventures themselves, means that there is a customizability in there for DMs who don't necessarily like inventing stuff for themselves or like, customizing adventures. They can run them as written, but there's still multiple ways to run them. Does anybody have like a favorite or from what they've heard, something that they're really excited for and anticipating from the Quest-o-Nomicon in terms of the adventures that are there? I know personally I'm interested in seeing what the grim kind of gothic horror looking adventure is like, but that's of course I am. That's me.
Really? You, Ben?
What a surprise!
I'm afraid I've got to be the fool for this one because I've seen the Questo trailer, but I have been so deep in the archives of Fables right now that I have not had the slightest opportunity to look at what's actually going on in Quest-o-Nomicon.
Oh, okay.
I love the skeleton guy. I love his sort of piratical look. I love all the different sort of like things that have been seen. But man, boy, if I could tell you anything about him.
Sean, have you had a chance to look, or you've been too busy bringing out the monster grimoire, which is on its way?
I am in the same boat as James, but I am interested in seeing the finished product in terms of that multi-pronged narrative and how it might help DMs, especially new DMs, learn how to run games that do have different spokes that are interchangeable, because that's a powerful tool in the DM toolbox, and there aren't a lot of great adventures that teach you how to do that. So I'm looking forward to that.
It's the blessing and the curse of the Forged by Ghostfire sort of line. Right? It's that we don't get in the way of the people who are making this cool thing. We trust them to make something awesome. But it ultimately means, for most of us, we don't know what the heck's going on.
Oh, it's cool. It's a cool, surprise. Almost put the words excitement and surprise together and was like, surprise. Anyway, Dale, have you? Is it the train heist that you're going to run to first? You think?
Oh, I'm torn because I love the train heist, which we've already talked about. I also really like the look of the piratical adventure with the ghost pirate bad guy. Looks really cool.
Yeah, it does. I love the cowboy looking one. That's the heist is one of those. I like that they've stepped outside of sort of typical fantasy as well, and are looking at, arguably more modern, not that cowboys and train heists are particularly modern, but you know what I mean. Anyway, usually by this point in the podcast, what we would do is jump into a sort of topic discussion, but there has been so much news in the last week or two around tabletop role-playing games, specifically Dungeons & Dragons. So what we're going to do this week is just roll on through more of the news, because not this weekend just gone, but the one before was D&D Celebration, where they announced a lot of things coming out of that, including Mordenkainen's Multiverse of Monsters. Wizards discussing a little bit about how they're going to change up the stat blocks for a sort of 5.5 point something a version of 5th edition, which we'll talk about in a second as well. Jeremy Crawford, I think, just posted an article either in the last 24 hours or more recently than that, discussing some of the changes. And we've talked about it among ourselves when they were first announced. I know, James, you've seen a little of these, so you need to be careful about what's in the public eye already and what's not. But I was actually surprised reading Jeremy's article, because it seemed to be a little less sweeping than what I was expecting last week. It's sort of fairly standard things in terms of, changing how they tag monsters with creature types and using less of the humanoid and being less didactic with how, they assign alignment to monsters. So
the internet blowing things out of proportion? I can't believe it.
That does tend to happen. Dale, have you seen the article that I'm talking about, or?
I haven't seen the article, and now I'm concerned, because here I was a big advocate for, let's totally rearrange the stat block. Let's do it. Let's move CR up to the top. It's giving me flashbacks to ages ago when James Introcaso posted on Twitter and said, if there was one thing you would change about monster stat blocks, what would it be? And I said, move the CR up to the top, because I had strong feelings about it. Sure. But no, I'm every time I run a monster from the monster manual, I rearrange all the information into a totally different order. And I was very excited at the prospect that such a thing could happen in official source material. So now maybe I have to temper my expectations a little bit.
I'm just curious, because you mentioned this last week. How do you change the stat blocks? Like, what are you reordering things into?
Yeah, so I basically reorder things into kind of skills that will possibly be necessary. So usually that covers like stealth and perception. But anything that could be significant to an encounter, I put sort of up the top, along with initiative bonuses and things like that. And then underneath that, I put everything that is an offensive ability and offensive stats. And then, I put defensive and then I put offensive. So it'll be like proficiency bonus, initiative bonus, stealth. And then the next section will be like hit points, AC, resistances. And then the next section will be, these are my attacks.
Okay. Do you retain the stats in terms of like strength, dex, con, or do you not? You throw those out because you feel you don't need them?
I keep any that will be relevant, if that makes sense. So if you're running a monster that doesn't have a particularly good charisma or wisdom score, then I basically just don't write it down. And if it does happen to come up, then I just treat it as a +0 or a -2 if I think it would be
Gotcha.
really, really bad. But I don't write it down because I feel like it's probably not going to come up, and I can decide on the fly what it'll be if it does come up.
Sean, are you relieved or are you disappointed, or you're neither here nor there in terms of the changes that they're talking about with the monster stat blocks?
I was looking forward to them making it easier for DMs to use. And that means different things to different people. As Dale just pointed out, she has a certain way that she thinks of things. I like the idea of pulling out the main attack that a monster would use, be it a melee attack, be it a spell, and putting that in a prominent location that the dungeon master will notice. Because challenge rating is based on the maximum amount of damage that a monster can do. And if a monster is a spellcaster and the DM doesn't realize that Cone of Cold is actually the most powerful spell in terms of damage as opposed to Fireball, they may just pick, oh, I'm just going to use Magic Missile because that's easy to use. And then they wonder why their encounter is so easy. DMs, especially newer DMs, could really use that help in ferreting out the best strategies. And I was hoping that the sort of UX experience of the monster would be changed to the point where it was more streamlined and easier to run. It sounds like that may be a very small part of it, but I haven't read the article, so I will withhold my judgment until I get that full information.
Sure, for sure. I think that, you know, specifically in spells, and we can crack that open in a second and really discuss, because that seems like that's the biggest change that is being made, is monsters don't have spell lists anymore, or stat blocks don't have spell lists anymore, but they will extrapolate those abilities out into actions, bonus actions, reactions, whatever is appropriate for the given stat block, although there's quite a few implications into that I think are interesting to break open. James, what are your thoughts on the changes to the stat blocks for upcoming publications?
Yeah, so I want to clarify something that you just said, Ben, actually, about spell lists, and this information is out there. It's been seen, and they actually aren't getting rid of spell lists in a lot of cases. It's just that these spell lists have been moved down underneath the actions heading rather than being in the sort of traits section of the monster. And this is kind of a big deal from a game design point of view, because it means one thing in particular. It means that a monster cannot know spells that can't be cast as an action. All of their spells and their spell lists are under the action heading.
Are some of them not being moved because they've got a new bonus action heading and they've always had the reaction heading? Are certain spells not being moved under those headings instead? That's what I assume.
Well, yeah, so I don't know that for sure, but I think what is more likely to happen is this. You've seen this happen, is that some spells have been kind of beefed out into their own full sort of like action block, right? Like what was the sort of cleric-y guy that was in the reveal a couple of weeks ago? I don't recall. They had like a holy fire action or something like that. That was somewhat spell-like. And a lot of people got into a kerfuffle about whether or not it could be counterspelled. And there's a whole sort of discourse cycle about that, right? So I don't have the full information on this one. And even if I did, I couldn't say anything. But I suspect that, for instance, a monster will not have like 3 spell lists, one for actions, one for bonus action, one for reaction. That's more complicated. I think instead they'll have a spell list of their most distilled down, useful, interesting spells under the action heading. And then if, say, the monster has like a Misty Step, which is a bonus action spell, they'll just make it its own header. They might not even say it's a spell. They might call it Misty Step and just say, oh, as a bonus action, the monster can instantly teleport up to 30 feet.
Right. That's interesting. I like the sound of that, because that's what I really want, is just for them to reduce the number of spells listed on any given stat block. That's my
ultimately that's what I want to.
Yeah, you know, I feel like streamlining that, simplifying that in a counterintuitive way kind of encourages variety during combat for the DM, because you don't have to stop and think about all these spells. You just go, which of these 4 spells do I want to use right now? And you can sort of mix it up every round of combat.
I want to talk about something that's maybe a little bit off the beaten track. This is kind of a James want that is never going to happen in a million years. But I want D&D to play more with elemental resistances, immunities, and vulnerabilities. They're an incredibly swingy part of monster design. Right, there's a reason why they don't, right? It's because it makes calculating a creature's actual difficulty really hard. But I love video games in particular that play with heavy elemental typings. Pokemon does it. I'm deep in the Persona series right now. Persona is like all about trial and error, finding out what a monster's elemental resistances and vulnerabilities are, so you can just demolish them in a single round. And I think that's a very sort of snappy and fun way of play that keeps monster fights from devolving into these arduous slogs in a way that D&D can do sometimes with their huge hit point totals. And I think it's a fun sort of like, oh, I figured it out moment. It's almost a puzzle like aha that happens in the middle of gameplay. And I'm like, oh, I want that in D&D. I want that sort of aha moment.
No, Z Bashu did a video talking about making a D&D game feel a bit more like The Witcher, and he talked about spending a lot of time researching monsters, making monsters really strong, but spending a long time researching their weaknesses so that when you realize, they're weak to, lightning, you can come in and kill them very efficiently. But the fun of having it be that puzzle of figuring it out, that kind of play I do think is definitely is super interesting. I also wonder whether it would kind of mitigate the overwhelming power of the action economy to some small degree. Maybe if you can kill 2 monsters worth in the time that it would ordinarily take to kill one, maybe you can afford to play around a bit more with the action economy and play around with the concept of being outnumbered.
Yeah, and it would require some changes to like martial classes especially, right? Because like if a fighter's just got bludgeoning, piercing, slashing, and you're up against elemental stuff, it's like, screw me, right? But anyway, sorry, go ahead, Sean.
No, this is something that we're working a little bit with in the Monster Grimoire, in terms of having monsters that you can't just run up to and kill. There needs to be some research. There may need to be some blacksmith or an alchemist involved before you are ready to take on a monster. And you won't know that until you meet that monster for the first time or do a lot of research into the monster. But that is, in some way, that's a double-edged sword. Because as much as I love those sort of puzzles, you hit the monster with a fireball and nothing happens. Oh, what do we do next? And there is I don't want to say a majority, but if it's not a majority, it is a large minority of players that hate to see their actions wasted. And you get a lot of grief in some cases when you create an adventure or a monster or a rule where that action is denied in some way.
Yeah. I think that damage resistances in immunities are a really interesting mechanic that struggles a bit in 5th edition as it currently is, because, a lot of the points that you three have already touched on, which is, if something's resistant, there's a lot of resistances to bludgeoning, piercing, slashing, let's just call it mundane damage, so I don't have to list them off every single time, but there's a lot of resistances or immunities to mundane damage, which means that, martial classes get left behind very quickly, but that balances it out very quickly because by level 5, 6, 7, generally by tier 2, let's say, everybody's probably got a magic weapon of some sort, which then just because magic, a magic weapon becomes this keyword that negates nearly all resistances, then those rules become completely irrelevant. Like they become negligible. It doesn't matter if a wraith is resistant to any sort of damage because everybody's either got magic or a way of, overcoming that. So, but the flip side of that is, and I've been a player in this situation, where you are the fighter or the ranger or whatever, and you just can't hit the thing because it's immune to all your attacks. You're fighting lycanthropes in tier 1. So you just sit in the corner and slap yourself in the face until the fight, until Fireball is cast and the fight's over. So it's a difficult design thing to solve.
In a perfect world, what James has described brings the party together. And Ben, what you described brings the party together because the wizard can cast more than Fireball, right? The wizard, the sorcerer could cast magic weapon, right? And that would then make the fight, that one spell basically doubles the amount of damage that the fighter can do or the rogue could do. But oftentimes the players are so focused in on that one thing. What can I do this round to maximize my damage? Not what can I do to maximize my damage over the course of 10 rounds or maximize someone else's damage. And if we got to a game where it really encouraged that work together as a team, you could make not just a really fun adventure, but a really fun game that put those puzzle pieces on the table and let the players work them out in a way that was enjoyable to them rather than detrimental to their play styles.
I think it's a really interesting function of D&D being a lot of different games to a lot of different people, right? If you had a game that was built specifically around exploiting weaknesses and kind of getting the upper hand on monsters like this, then everyone comes into the game with that sort of expectation, and there's no weird feelings about it. But as it stands, D&D is a game of like, oh, I am a unique, cool character with this is my signature weapon. Don't ask me to get rid of my signature weapon. And like, that's a super legit style of play. I love characters with an iconic weapon that they never change from, and like that's a core part of their identity. And you just can't have it always for all people.
Yeah, it's hard. How do you without changing what the monsters are per se, there's challenge ratings attached to each monster. So, you can create encounters of different difficulties, but without changing what the monsters are, how do you play with the difficulty? Because what I'm alluding to is, to jump back to The Witcher 3 temporarily, you can play that game on the hardest difficulty, which I do because I enjoy the experience of being a witcher and investigating the monsters and making sure I've got the oils on my blade and if I need bombs and which sign am I going to use, and sort of equipping myself appropriately, which if you play that game on the hardest difficulty, you have to engage in those systems to be able to kill certain monsters. Or you can drop it to the lowest difficulty, which is an equally valid way of play. But if you sink points into your sword skills, there's an ability where you just hold down the button and Geralt just like goes into some swirling dervish of swords. And it's like, how do you, both styles are very valid, but how do you accommodate for both in a role-playing game system where you're not just changing what the monsters are? I want ghosts in this graveyard, but I don't want ghosts to feel inaccessible or too accessible to either play style.
Oh yeah, well when you figure it out, tell me, and I'm sure I'll pay you a lot of money for it. I mean, that's the final chestnut,
I'll get right on it. We are starting to run out of time here, but we'll just very, very briefly. I mean, it feels like it's the biggest thing since sliced bread. This announcement of a 5.5 thing that's version. We're not allowed to say edition, but version that's on the horizon, which is very exciting. Looks like a consolidation, maybe, at least, anything. The reason we won't give it too much time is because anything we say really is just speculation at this point. But I thought maybe a fun thing to do is to quickly whip around and just, what is each a fun wish list thing that we would love to see maybe in a 5.5 version, starting with Dale.
I don't know if I have like a specific thing I want to see in 5.5 so much as I just want to see 5.5 take its time. Take its time before it comes out, I feel like they're going to be rebuilding a lot of things from the ground up, even if they keep a lot of the old concepts that we're familiar with. And I just want them to take it slow, give it the attention and the respect that it deserves, and also give my homebrew videos that I make my living from time to still be relevant. That's my wish list.
Fair. Sean, what about you?
I think Dale hit the nail right on the head directly with take your time. So I will go with let's make a streamlined version that is very easy for new DMs to pick up and play, and is very easy for new players who may have only come across the game via streams or at some point via the D&D movie or D&D TV shows, to get them into the game quickly and easily. And you can always build on from there, but it's hard to subtract complexity from a game.
I'm curious, Sean, and obviously, like I said, what we're saying is pure speculation. So simply from your perspective, if you were in the shoes of someone who had to create a 5.5, which for the record is our name and the internet's name for it. I don't think they've called it 5.5 or anything like that. But what would you do to make it more accessible?
Just pare down some of the rules. The important thing is making DMs comfortable running the game, because without DMs, the game will eventually go away. So we want people to we need to teach them not just the rules, but how to tell great stories, and how to tell great stories with their friends, and the different ways to do that, different types of stories you can tell with the rules that are there. So, all of that is very important.
For sure. James, what about you? Anything you're hoping to see?
Yeah, I agree deeply with both Dale and Sean, actually. Getting those new DMs on board is really important, and doing it thoughtfully is incredibly important. Once a very streamlined and simple chassis for 5e has been built, I hope that Wizards kind of returns to the style of thinking they had in the D&D Next playtest, when 5e was going to be a highly modular edition. There was a lot of talk really early on in 5e's development, which is like 8 years ago now, which I'm a little uncomfortable with, if I can say that. 8 years? Damn. Uh-oh. And if we have a simple, streamlined game, like hell, don't have skills in streamlined, simple baseline 5e. Don't have different types of weapons. Have simple one-handed, simple two-handed, heavy one-handed, heavy two-handed, that sort of thing. Keep it really, really simple. And then if people want to get into nitty-gritty details, more martial maneuvers or highly detailed weapon mechanics or something like that, then you can have an individual module for it. And just have all the adventures key off of the simple 5e rules and trust that their dungeon masters will be able to integrate the rules modules that they like into this sort of simple, streamlined form.
That's really interesting to see, to hear, rather, the three of you say that, because I feel like I would almost say the opposite. But instead of saying what I was going to say, maybe instead just like pitching it as a question, which is, my prediction, of course, not knowing anything, but my prediction had always been that if they were to do something like what they've announced, that it would be a kind of consolidation of all the things, because when I started running D&D, and I came on board halfway through 5th, but I needed 3 books, which was the Player's Guide, the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and the DMG. And now I need like 5 or 6 books because of Xanathar's and Tash's and the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, the forgotten cousin of those supplements. And there feels like there's sort of this increasing, I don't want to use the term bloat, but it feels like there's this increasing need to kind of keep up with every supplement, which isn't obviously a business strategy in some aspects. So my thought had been, actually, instead of simplifying the rules, they would consolidate a lot of them so that you only needed, a handful of books, which is what it feels like the Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse is coming with Tash's and Xanathar's in a little gift box in January. So it feels like that is like, here is the 5e expansion set for the time being.
I was just going to say, it's really interesting that you say that, because when I first started playing RPGs, I went with Pathfinder instead of D&D because I felt like all the rules were here in one book. Like, yeah, there were expansions, there were extra things that came out, but you didn't need them. Everything you need is in this one book. And it took me a really long time to move over to D&D, and even then, a really long time to not just use the Player's Handbook. And that's still my preference when I'm, designing homebrew or anything, is that I build from just the Player's Handbook, because I think that should be the only thing that any player needs to actually run the game. That any purchaser needs to become a DM. You just need the Player's Handbook. If you want to play a character, you just need the Player's Handbook. So I think when I say, keep it simple, simplify everything, streamline it all, I think in part I kind of mean a similar thing to you, is take these things that you've implemented into Tash's and you've said, oh, well, that's kind of the new take on how to make characters. And put them all together in the one book and just go, these are the bits we like now. Now that we've had time, now that we've had 8 years to take all this stuff in and tweak things and change things, this is the new version of a core rulebook and what that looks like.
Is that what, James and Sean, you are also envisaging in what you said, or are you thinking of something that maybe does have multiple smaller supplements that allows DMs to put things on and take things off at their leisure?
Truly, I would say, if you've ever read 4th edition Essentials, do something like that for 5e. Highly streamlined, highly simplified version of the core game, and keep it, relatively intercompatible, but let all the baggage go and bring it back to the basics and go from there.
Yeah, what James said is absolutely spot on. especially the idea of like getting rid of skills completely, because technically you don't need them. But if you do keep them, then make sure the class abilities are pared down a bit to just make things easier to follow for all players.
It's kind of the corollary to what I was saying earlier about how D&D has to kind of be everything for all people. It has to be a very sort of middle ground game. The more detail gets put into the core of D&D, we'll call it, the harder a time it has to be a highly sort of inventive and malleable rule set. So if you keep a tight, small, highly malleable core, and then a lot of sort of flavorful pick and choose modules, then you have a much easier time of being able to make D&D the game you want it to be.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do think, like, when you say get rid of the skills, I'm like, but I love the skills and they're really informative. But on the flip side, I can see someone who hasn't been playing D&D for, a couple of years. I look at the Call of Cthulhu character sheet and there's like 70 skills or something. It's not that many, but there's like, maybe 20, even 15, 20 skills on there, and you just get lost in them. That being said, that is where we're going to leave it for today because we are out of time. But if you want to keep the conversation going, as James alluded to earlier, if you want to tell us what you think, all our Twitter handles are just below if you're watching this on YouTube, our names, so you can find us on Twitter. If you're not watching this on YouTube, pardon me, you can email us, podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. Send your emails through. I will read through them. I can't guarantee that I will reply to all of them, but I will grab a few for us to talk about next week on the podcast or the week after. So if you want to be in touch with us, send us an email, podcast@ghostfiregaming.com, and we'll try to get to those at the end of next week's episode. If you are listening on YouTube or iTunes or Spotify, wherever you happen to be, consider subscribing if you've enjoyed, so you never miss an episode. We'll be here every week talking about tabletop RPGs and Dungeons and Dragons. Tell your friends, spread rumors in a tavern, get the word out there because we are here now and here to stay. I've been Ben Byrne here with James Hake, Sean Merwin, Dale Kingsmill, and we will see you all next week.